I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. On this episode, I have a conversation with Emily Cherniack, the Executive Director of New Politics, an organization focused on recruiting and electing leaders who've served the country through military service. In fact, New Politics has helped elect some members of Congress who you may be familiar with, like Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger of Virginia, or Representative Seth Moulton of Massachusetts. Over the years, there's been a decline in the number of people who've served in the military, then run for office. And Emily explains what's behind that decline. We also talk about what people who've served in the military bring to the table in elected positions. And it might not be what you think. So, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Emily Cherniack of New Politics. Emily Cherniack, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I read this interesting statistic recently about the percentage of members of Congress who had served in the military. And about 50 years ago, I think, it was the majority of Congress had served in the military in some capacity, right?
Yep.
And now I think it's around 20% or somewhere under 20%. Mm-hmm. Why is that, right? And why was the link there to begin with?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think when I started to think of this idea of New Politics, which is recruiting, servant leaders to run for office, I looked at this data. It was really surprising that such a low percentage now of people serving. And I think partly that is about World War II, the Greatest Generation, a lot of them went into public service, and there are just a lot more veterans. So I think, obviously we have less than 1% of the country who has served, so that's part of it. But I think the other part is that a lot of people who have service backgrounds just don't go into politics, and for lots of reasons, but we are at the lowest number in history. So I think when people talk about partisan gridlock and Congress not working, maybe isn't a causal relationship, but I feel like it's a high correlation between the lowest number of service people in Congress and the highest level of gridlock that we've seen in our history.
Even at the federal level, I remember when it was pretty common to have a president or someone, on the ballot who served, right? And mm-hmm. I think out of the, 46 presidencies we've had, the most recent, the modern presidencies have not had military service, right? I think 15 out of 46 did not. So that's even become kind of common at the presidential level. But why do you think it's important? What perspective do you think that they bring, even in a legislative capacity, someone who's served in the military?
Yeah, I think a lot of people obviously sort of think about, well, they've served in war, therefore they're going to have a perspective on foreign policy, which I think is true. But I think the other aspects that I think a lot of people miss is that, people who have served, they've had some really unique leadership development opportunities in their service. So, between the ages of 18 and 25, they have worked on diverse teams. They have worked with people from different ideologies, from different parts of the country. They've had to lead people and bring diverse groups of people together towards a common mission, a common goal that is not about themselves. And they've also had to get on the job, like problem solving. So they're dropped into places and have to kind of problem solve and figure it out. So it's on the boots on the ground, boots on the ground training. And I think all of those leadership skills, and they're sort of drilled in them, this notion of country first. And I think all of that together are really important leadership skills that are really invaluable in political life. And so I think besides maybe the perspective of, being in war, the perspective of foreign policy, it's those leadership skills that I think were what we really need now more than ever.
One of the very first candidates that you recruited to run for office was Seth Moulton of Massachusetts. How did you convince him to run?
Yeah, so I had gone to David Gergen, I live in Boston. So David Gergen is at Harvard, and I had gone to him. And I was a City Year kid, so I did a AmeriCorps program called City Year, and David Gergen was very much a champion of that organization. So I had met him through my former boss, Alan Casey. And I had pitched David this idea, and he was like, I love this idea. I think it's totally needed. David had served in military. He also had served 4 presidents. So he had sort of seen the rise and fall of the service veterans in political life. And he was like, I love this idea. Seth Moulton is the kind of person you're talking about. Like, he should run for Congress one day. And I had met Seth when he was at the Kennedy School, and Alan Casey, my boss, and I were doing national service policy. And so Seth, I called him and I was like, hey, would you ever think about running for Congress? And sort of serendipitously, there was where Seth was born and raised in Massachusetts, the congressman at the time had a scandal, and he was kind of vulnerable. So there was sort of the universe kind of all the stars aligned for sort of a situation where, he possibly could run. And so I had called him, and he was living in Texas working on high-speed rail, which if you ever have met Seth Moulton, you would know that is like his passion in life, is to make sure that we have high-speed rail around the country. And he was like, I'm not interested. I'm working on high-speed rail. Like, I'm living my dream, And at that point, I didn't have a job. And this was sort of the one thing I was trying to do. And I was sort of like, if Seth doesn't do it, then I don't know what else I'm going to do. So I just kept calling him. And he was visiting his parents in Massachusetts. So he was like, I'm here. Let's just like get coffee. I think he was like trying to be polite. But I just was like, I'm persistent. And I finally said yes. But it was it was a slog. But thankfully he said yes. And here we are.
Oh, that's funny. That kind of makes sense because I don't know if everyone knows this, but he has a background in physics. I think he studied at Harvard. So,
Yes.
the high-speed rail thing makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So I asked, where did you find him? I think at the time he was kind of everywhere talking about, not everywhere, but I know that he'd done some media appearances talking about 9/11 and talking about the Iraq War and, critical of that. Was that around the same time?
Yeah, a little bit after that. And it was really interesting when he was thinking of running, and we had talked to people in Massachusetts about it, and very, very, a lot of progressive liberals here. And they all thought he was for the war, like without even knowing anything about him because he was a veteran. This interesting thing happened where a lot of people were like, oh my God, he's going to like send us to war. So it is interesting, I think, when you think about veterans running for office, some people have this sort of stigma of like, well, they're just going to want to go to war. When actually, I would say not all of them, but because they have served overseas, it's something they really would take serious consideration about sending others over there. But it's interesting, like, I think the reaction we had got in the beginning when he was running, a lot of people were like, he's for the war. He wants to like stay there forever. So, yeah.
Yeah, that, I was actually going to ask you about that just generally, not necessarily just about Seth, but just generally having people who, have served in the military. And that's a part of their message or campaign message. Like, hey, look, I'm great for this office because I've served, in this capacity. People make this assumption that they are kind of, people throw the word around or the phrase around warmongers, right? Or they favor military action over diplomacy. But when you really think about it, it doesn't really make sense. It's not a logical connection because if you've been to war, you know how important it is to try to avoid it at all costs.
Exactly.
Did Seth hear that when he was on the campaign trail at all, or?
Yeah. And we polled it. Like, I remember it was a real data point. And he had to really explicitly talk about that because the assumption was that he was for war. So he had to really explicitly say how he felt about the war and how he feels about us going to war as a country.
Yeah, but honestly, it really doesn't matter because even people who haven't been in the military are often accused of being warmongers. I'm not really sure how people make those associations, but they, that accusation is out there. So it's hard to avoid. So let's fast forward to today where we've got, Russia. And America may or may not get directly involved. Right now, we're still on the side of diplomacy. But how would having more members of the military in Congress, for instance, how would it shape those debates, you think? Like this specifically with Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, it's actually a timely question because Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill from New Jersey, we did a call with her the other day, and she actually is a Russia expert. And so she actually asked to go over there. So she went over to Ukraine because she sort of was like, we need to see what's going on. And so her and some other members went over there recently, a few weeks ago, and to really kind of see what's going on. And so it was interesting hearing, her perspective on that. I think I'm not a foreign policy expert, so there's not much else I can say about it, except that I will say that, having these types of leaders, the Mikey Sherrill, Jason Crow, Elaine Luria, Mike Gallagher, Peter Meyer, having them in Congress makes me feel so much better about decisions we make about foreign policy. Because for someone like Mikey, who studied it and has been over there and has boots on the ground experience, she knows what she's talking about. And I think that is really helpful in how we navigate this really complex thing going on with these countries.
So, aside from these debates we have about war and military action, how do you think that having someone with a military background would shape other debates that we're having right now, like about healthcare or voting rights? Is there an advantage to having served in the military, you think, in those debates?
Absolutely. I think, Seth Moulton always says this when he first got to Congress and after he'd been there for a little while. What he always says, and I agree with him, and it's sort of why I do the work I do, is, he said that like there are a lot of smart people. There are a lot of people that are working hard. There are a lot of people that are well-intentioned. He said the one thing that's missing from most of Congress is courage. He's like, and it's the courage to actually do what's right. He's like, a lot of people know what to do. They just don't do it because they're afraid. And so I think when you have people that Seth's like, I've been shot at, like, it's just not that hard to tell the truth to a constituent about why you voted the way you did,
Yeah.
So I think when you've been through those situations and you've just, you're framing this country first, I think you're just willing to say the truth and not hide and really stand up for your votes. And I think we've seen that with many of these members is they're just sort of willing to kind of do what's right and work together to get things done. I mean, they are actually some of the most bipartisan members of Congress. They're the most effective in working with others to get things done. And I think that's what they're really good at. So whether it's domestic or foreign policy, their goal is to like, how do we solve it? How do we get it done? And who can we work together to do that?
Now, speaking of bipartisanship, and I know that you recruit both Democrats and Republicans, is there a reason why? I think I read that most of your recruits have been Democrats. Is that who's stepping up, or why is that?
Yeah, a few things. I mean, one is it's been a tough climate over the past 4 years for Republicans. So we do have a lot of people that didn't run because it was just a tough climate politically to be a Republican in a primary.
You don't say.
Yeah. For, obvious reasons. Yeah. And so I think for the most part, we've never needed to be 50-50. That was never my goal. I think for us, it's about, where are the most transformational leaders. So you could have 20 Republicans who are B players and don't do a lot, or you could have 5 that are really transformational and game changing. Right. And so for us, it's about where are the game changing leaders and where do we invest in them? And so right now we actually have we have 2 that are challenging Republicans in primaries who should, in my opinion, deserve to be challenged. And we have a few open seats with some really great Republican candidates in pretty red districts. So I think we're getting a little bit more balance now that, it's past 2020. I think we'll see more of a new generation of Republican leaders, I'm hopeful, that are coming up who will be good for the country and good for our democracy.
So you've got 2 people who are challenging Republicans, 2 Democrats who are challenging, or Republicans who are challenging Republican incumbents?
2 Republicans that are challenging Republican incumbents in primaries and very red districts. The Democrat would never win there.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that. I think Nancy Pelosi recently said that we needed a Republican Party that was functional, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think she got a lot of criticism for that. And I don't think people understand that, without 2 functioning parties, you're not going to be in both parties, right?
Right.
I mean, you're going to be in one or the other. And I think that people who are in the Democratic Party, just because we've had all of these problems with the Republican Party, don't fully take into account the necessity of having 2 functioning parties for a balanced government, right? And right now, I can't say that the Republican Party is really functioning right now. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but it is really important for a good balanced government.
Exactly. No, I agree. And it's why we're bipartisan. I think first, service transcends political parties, but also people have come at me all the time about that. They're like, why aren't you Democratic only? Like shame on you for supporting Republicans and all of those things. And I agree with you. I think at the end of the day, our democracy won't work. We're never going to have a supermajority of one party or the other. I don't care what anyone says. You might have 1 year or a cycle where you're winning back the House or whatever, but it's never going to work unless you have functional people, and also that you take out the obstructionists. Like there are several people who are actually really bad for democracy and are instigating a lot of it. And so it's not everybody. If you can take out the ones that are the loudest in the room, it really makes a difference in the culture of Congress, and you can change that for the better.
So I know you have a new project called the New Power Project. What is that exactly?
Yeah, so the New Power Project is really focusing on BIPOC potential candidates. I've been doing this work now for about 12, 13 years, and I've been sort of working on the new politics idea for almost 10 years. I, called Seth Moulton in the summer of 2012, even though New Politics was not like officially an organization yet. It was just an idea at that time. But for 10 years, I've been really thinking about this idea of who runs and what are the barriers for entry. And I think that on the journey, I've really, realized there are significant barriers that are even steeper for BIPOC people in general, right? People who want to run. And I've just seen some really challenging, our candidates who are amazing, and just the pushback they get, the barriers that they face, who are our candidates of color, are really significant. And so one thing we have been trying to think about and do is how do we really invest resources in helping recruit and support, a more diverse pipeline of leaders, and especially at the local level, because I think, that's where you can really build a pipeline and it sets people up for success. It's hard to run for Congress right away as a first-time candidate. You have to be able to raise like $1 million or $2 million, and very few people have the resources and networks to do that. But if you look at Congress, half of Congress comes from the state legislature. 20% were former mayors, and most mayors are formerly city councilors, right? So you can start people in places where they can win. For example, David Crowley, who we worked with in 2015, he ran for city council in Milwaukee. He lost that race, but the next year there was a state rep seat open, and he ran and won that. And then in 2017, the county executive role opened up for Milwaukee, and he ran and won. He couldn't have run for county executive from the jump as a first-time candidate, but because he started out in city council and then, ran for that and then state rep, he was able to build an infrastructure. And county executive was what Scott Walker had that role before he ran for governor. So it's a real pipeline for statewide office. And David Crowley is the first African American, in the history of Milwaukee to hold that seat. So he is sort of our like role model of a story of if you get people set up and help them get their foot in the door and run, and they can then go on to have a political future. And finally, I'll say, as we all know, like democracy should be representative of our communities. And if it's not, and if our electorate doesn't look like the communities that we're serving, then it's not a democracy at all. So I think our goal is to really try to get more representation into political power, because that really matters.
Exactly. So the New Power Project, is it open to all people of color candidates, or do they have to have a background in military service too? Or is that separate?
They don't have to have military service. We still vet people on our core values as an organization. They have to be what we say a servant leader. And so we vet them on, values, culture alignment, mission alignment, and kind of go from there. So, but yeah, they don't have to have like a military background to be part of the project.
But for the people that you are recruiting with military backgrounds, it sounds like you're also running them at the state legislative level as well.
Yeah, actually 70% of our candidates are down ballot, right? So they're running for state rep, state senate, city council.
Okay. Have you ever considered running yourself?
No, I appreciate the question, because I think it's like if people don't ask me directly, they always like think I'm doing this to like run for office. I will never run. One of the programs we offer at New Politics, our academy, it's our training arm, is we do something called Answering the Call. And it's grounded in, real leadership development work. Ron Heifetz, a professor at Harvard, and others had developed this sort of leadership model about being really clear about who you are and your core values. And so we kind of make everyone go through that before they decide what they want to do in the political arena, whether they want to run for office, whether they want to be a candidate or a campaign staffer, whether they want to, work for a member. Everybody should play a role. And we really believe in that. And, not everyone will run for office, and that's okay. But everyone has to be clear about their core values and who they are. And so in doing that work, what's really clear to me is my role is to do what I'm doing now, to like really build infrastructure, build support, and help as many people as possible to run, because then our country will only get better if we elect people who put the country first. So being a candidate is not my jam. It's like not my journey. And I'm really clear about that. So that's like a long answer to no, but I want to give you context for why, because I'm really not running ever. Like never.
So let's say there's someone who served in the military, or maybe they have a partner or a family member who's served, and they're listening to this conversation and they're on the fence about running. What would you say to them?
We really think that everybody should think about getting involved in the political arena. And so a lot of people who say, that's not for me, I don't do politics. Like that is who we're looking for. Like you are someone, if you're listening to this, like you're the person actually that we want to recruit. And so just know that you have been asked to run for office, and you have been asked to get into the political arena in whatever way feels comfortable for you. But the more of us that can engage in the political space, the better our democracy will be. So I just challenge everyone to think about that, especially those who have served, and appreciate everyone's service to their country and asking you to serve again in this way.
Right. I agree with that. I mean, so if you have a background in military service, Emily, is, for you. But if you don't and you still want to run, you should consider it. And there are dozens of orgs, who can help people with, non-traditional political backgrounds get into the game. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah. And actually one thing, we actually do national service as well. So if you've done any type of community, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, any type of sort of significant service, we're your people. So feel free to reach out.
Well, Emily Cherniack, thank you so much for joining me. And thank you for all the good work you're doing.
No, thank you for having me, and appreciate you. And this is great.